Now, it's one of the biggest and wealthiest charities in the world, worth, as I mentioned earlier, some $16 billion. It's also one of the most prominent grant givers globally and locally here in Nigeria. The Ford Foundation has donated millions of dollars to civil society and good governance projects, working with, for instance, the Electoral Commission, INEC, and NGOs, as well as relevant government agencies in pursuit of good governance and of the objective of supporting the conduct of free, fair and credible elections in Nigeria and across West Africa. And they do this by lending support, particularly in areas where there may be budgetary shortfalls. So just how does this relationship work? Beyond being a development partner and giving considerable amounts of money, how much influence does the foundation exert over the government agencies and civil society groups that they choose to partner with? How do they measure the success of their support? We'll talk about all that in a moment, but first, here's a little snippet from the Ford Foundation's promotional video.
The challenges we face today are becoming more complex, each of them rooted in what we believe is the defining issue of our time: inequality.
Everything that's wrong with our society was a set of choices, and the beautiful thing about that is that we can make different choices.
Queremos ser vistos como personas con valor. Queremos dignidad para nosotros. Estamos buscando justicia.
At the Ford Foundation, we support visionaries on the front lines of social change, tackling inequality worldwide.
What really inspires me and brings me joy is the work of building and mobilizing and transforming power in terms of how the community reconfigures itself in a more egalitarian way.
Today, the work of these pioneers is more critical than ever. They are showing us that justice is possible. They are reimagining what equality looks like.
I'm somebody who believes that anything is possible and that our fight is to make the impossible possible in our lifetime.
We are with them, as always, providing steadfast support and helping bring their stories to the world.
And that's a little clip there from the Ford Foundation, giving us a sense of what they do. Well, the president of the Ford Foundation, Darren Walker, is visiting Nigeria on a short trip. And he joins me now in the studio, along with the foundation's regional director in West Africa, Dr. Chichi Aniagolu. Okoye. Thank you very much indeed to both of you for coming in.
Thank you, Charles. I'm happy to be here.
And you've had a bit of a whirlwind visit, haven't you? I mean, you're only here for 3 days, and I was looking through your itinerary. I mean, you're doing so much in such a short period of time. Tell us more about what you've been doing in Nigeria.
Well, I've had the privilege of coming to this country for an important democracy summit that will be happening tomorrow here in Abuja. Yesterday, I was with colleagues in Lagos, where we heard from organizations and partners we support in the area of youth development, in the arts, and I had an opportunity to visit with colleagues in the office in Lagos. I must tell you, Charles, I love coming to Nigeria. You must understand that I am a...
Well, I'd be astonished if you say you hate it.
Well, but you would probably not expect me to tell you that as a Black American, a son of America,
right,
how much at home I feel when I come to this country, when I come to this continent. What an emotional experience, a level of intensity that I don't experience when I travel to other parts of the world, which I do quite frequently.
And what's it been like? You're the regional director, having the president of the foundation coming to your turf.
Well, I have to say that Darren is one of the most passionate, dynamic leader that I have had to work with, and he is so inspiring, and his energy is unbelievable. I mean, he got
well,
off
you
the
can
plane.
feel it.
Yes, he got off the plane, and on Sunday evening we had an event with a lot of high net worth individuals, and he was like, you know, he was totally at home and had a lot to share. And I think one of the things that's really amazing about Darren is how quick he is able to absorb information and share it, and how funny he is. I mean, he's been telling stories about, you know, little bits of experiences that he's had, and it's been amazing. But I think for the partners, it's just absolutely wonderful to have the president in their midst and
Absolutely.
to share the
Very
work.
encouraging, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah. But let me ask you this, for people who are not that sort of familiar with the Ford Foundation, I mean, in practice, beyond the sort of the big theory of what it, I mean, how did the Ford Foundation get started? I understand it was linked to the profits of the Ford Motor Car Company all the way back to 1936.
Indeed, Charles, we were founded in 1936 by Edsel Ford, the son of Henry Ford, with a $35,000 contribution. When Edsel Ford died, much of his estate was in Ford Motor Company privately held stock. And in order to resolve the tax on the family trust, a significant part of that estate was transferred to the Ford Foundation. That initial Ford Motor Company stock in 1943 is now worth, in a diversified portfolio, approximately $16 billion.
That's extraordinary. But I understand the Ford Foundation is now independent of the Ford Motor Company.
That is correct. We're independent of the Ford Motor Company and the Ford family, and we're happy to say that Henry Ford III is a trustee.
But it's amazing, isn't it, that here you are talking very proudly, very volubly about the fact that you are an African American, but the legacy of the foundation is, to say the least, complicated, isn't it? Because I was listening to one of your interviews where you were saying that the foundation was founded by someone whose legacy appears to be linked to racism and anti-Semitism. But here you are, an African American leading the foundation today.
Well, there's no doubt that many of the great industrialists, capitalists who founded foundations that we know by name were generally racist men. They lived in a time when racial hierarchy and American-style apartheid was accepted as normal. They were often, and certainly in the case of Mr. Ford, anti-Semitic. And he regrettably, that legacy with the name remains. Although later in life, he apologized for his views and what he did to contribute to American isolationism during the 1930s.
Very interesting. And let me ask you, Dr. Chichi, the Ford Foundation is about giving people everywhere in the world, where it can, a better life. I mean, tell us how that translates into practical reality in a country such as Nigeria, although your remit is obviously beyond Nigeria, it's West Africa, but we're in Nigeria.
Yes. So the Ford Foundation opened its doors in Nigeria in the late 1950s, and historically we have actually supported almost every sector in the country. The first decade was dedicated to building the workforce for the new country. So a lot of the focus was on education, fellowships, scholarships to scholars, to academics, to government officials. And following from that, the next decade was about building institutions that will then power, growth and development. So the focus was on agriculture, on education, on health, on those kinds of issues. And that, of course, if you think about most policies in Nigeria, most significant policies have a Ford footprint. But recently, we are now focusing on what I call development issues that have been neglected. So we're looking at the core of the things that make development difficult to happen in West Africa. So we're looking at things like, women's empowerment. Especially the prevention of gender-based violence, which a lot of people talk about, but there's not a lot of resources going into it. We're also looking at natural resource and climate change, because Nigeria is a natural resource dependent country and a fossil fuel dependent country. And so we're looking at how to ensure that the extraction that happens in the country actually benefits the communities where the extraction is coming from, and that the government policies and practices are organized in a way that ensures, that the country also benefits and the people benefit from natural resources. For gender-based violence, we are looking at how do we actually prevent gender-based violence? A lot of the focus is on addressing gender-based violence, on response, on working with the police, on building safe houses. But we recognize that if you talk to 10 women who have faced violence and ask them, do you want a perfect response, or do you want it not to have happened in the first place? I think that majority of them will say they would rather it didn't happen in the first place.
Absolutely.
So we're looking at prevention, and we're looking at the core of the reason for gender-based violence, which is social norms, that tacitly approve of gender-based violence. So we're working with leaders of faith and culture and women's groups to address the social and religious norms that give credence and normalize gender-based violence.
Very interesting. And Mr. Walker, you're not here, obviously. You're sort of on top of the pecking order in America, where you kind of see or try to see what is going on with all your sort of branches around the world. I mean, do you see things changing in Nigeria for the better as a result of the intervention of the philanthropy of the Ford Foundation?
Well, let me say that one of the things I see, and we have seen for a number of years, is the phenomenon, the scourge of inequality, which is a global phenomenon, and
Absolutely.
we find in every region of the world we work, from the United States to Latin America to here in Nigeria, India, Indonesia. The reality is, as a foundation committed to reducing inequality, we must have a laser-like focus on that objective, not only because it addresses the issues of resource allocation, because one of the reasons inequality exists is because of the unequal distribution of resources, a lack of shared prosperity, which in turn affects access to education, to health care, to decent and affordable housing, etc. These are all the foundations for living with dignity, which is what we believe every person deserves. So inequality is in many ways the most harmful barrier to prosperity, to a vibrant democracy. And that is because, Charles, inequality asphyxiates hope, and hope is the oxygen of democracy. When a society, a people are hopeless, that democracy is in trouble. Now we are seeing in many parts of the world, beginning with my own country, Charles, Nigeria is not alone. Inequality has grown in America, and there are implications in our country for the growth of inequality, just as there is in India, as there is in Turkey, in Hungary, in Brazil, etc.
But do you see, I mean, I'll ask you that question and perhaps put it to her as well, since she's on the ground here, but do you see from your perch on top of the Ford Foundation and all your ideology and the philosophy that you so fervently want to promote around the world, do you see Nigeria's leaders being ready to confront the things that retard this inequality that you're talking about? For example, democratic development in this country, or is that an uncomfortable conversation for you?
It's not an uncomfortable conversation at all. Democracy is messy. The participation of the citizenry is challenging to create a coherent sense of alignment and shared mission and vision. And so the challenge for democracies is to find commonality among people. And that is a challenge in just about every democracy, because the things that affect resource allocation, that affect who has and who does not have, are often things like race, ethnicity, gender. And these elements play a large role in whether a society is vulnerable and is vulnerable to divisiveness, is vulnerable to authoritarians and people who are not working for the betterment of all people, but are working for the betterment of just a few. And so the challenge of democracy, and the challenge for Nigeria over an arc of history, because it is impossible at any one point to say, have we succeeded? Democracy is a process. It is never perfected, but you must have institutions. And one of the things I think we have succeeded at is supporting a strong civil society. Because where there is a strong civil society, there is possibility for democracy to succeed.
That's a very interesting point. But let me ask you this, Dr. Chichi Aniagolu Okoye, because you are here in Nigeria. You were there here at the last election, and I know that the Ford Foundation gave considerable support to the Electoral Commission, INEC. I mean, what's your assessment of whether that actually bore fruit?
Well, I think like Darren said, democracy is a process. And there's no question that we had challenges with the last election, but I think that we've learned lessons from it. And like Darren said, a lot of the support that we actually gave was to civil society organizations that have been able to go through, have looked through what happened during the elections and are learning lessons from it. And as you can see, there's a lot of conversations again about electoral reforms and constitutional reforms. And I think that's what we try to do. We want countries to get better. We want people to look at, to learn lessons from what has happened. And I think that we are in the process of doing that. And civil society is doing the best that it can. Whether we can do it better, no question. But I think that as long as we have an open society, as long as we have a society in which civil society is allowed to thrive, I think that we will make mistakes, but we will be in a position to also correct those mistakes.
That's a good point. And Darren, Mr. Walker, you've written a book. I think we've got a soft copy of it on the screen. You've written a book called From Generosity to Justice, a new gospel of wealth. Okay, you were supposed to have it there, but anyway, that is it. It's a fascinating book, and it's a sort of guide to or manual for philanthropy in the 21st century, isn't it? Just give us a synopsis of what it's about.
Well, it is based on Andrew Carnegie's seminal 1889 essay, The Gospel of Wealth, which is in many ways the foundational document for American philanthropy. Rockefeller, Mellon, Ford, and others followed his philosophy, which was that the work of men like him and Rockefeller and others was to be generous, to be charitable, to give back. Indeed, he coined the term to give back. I believe that in the 21st century, giving back is insufficient. I believe that charity and generosity are insufficient because I believe we must be in pursuit of justice and dignity. And that's a different philosophy, that's a different theory of operating for a philanthropist because it requires the wealthy to get uncomfortable. It requires the wealthy to interrogate their own behavior, their own wealth, how it was earned, and to look at the problems they say they are seeking to solve, and their own complicity and implication in those very problems that are often about inequality and lack of access to the masses, while we who are privileged are able to have our advantage compounded, while the disadvantaged are even more compounded.
That's a good point. And in one bit of the book, I think the preface, you say you believe that the social mobility escalator has ground to a halt, and that has set in place, your words, an insidious, inescapable hopelessness that has begun to, I think you mentioned that earlier, asphyxiate, lovely imagery there, asphyxiate democratic values and institutions. Now, if that is happening in America, imagine what's going on here in terms of justice and social mobility and hopelessness.
Absolutely, it's understandable, and it's the reason why I met with a group of philanthropists on Sunday evening as well as yesterday to, in some ways, share my idea to with all humility, submit to philanthropists here that charity is not enough, that giving back is not enough. It may require giving up something in order to have a society where there is more shared prosperity, where there is more opportunity. At the end of the day, this will redound to everyone's benefit. A society where only the very wealthy possess opportunity, possess the chance for a bright future, is not a society that is sustainable. And in my own country, this is what I'm saying, and it certainly is what I'm saying in other parts of the world.
And here you are, Dr. Chichi Aniagolu Okoye. You're at the top of the philanthropy, if you like, ladder in West Africa with the Ford Foundation. But the foundation doesn't actually implement the support it gives. So how do you manage to ensure that the support you give is effective? I mean, listening to Darren talk there, I mean, great ideas, great thoughts, great things that you aim to achieve and for which you give support to be achieved. But I'm wondering how you're able to ensure that what you want achieved is achieved.
Well, first of all, we deliberately don't implement because we don't believe that we know what the problems are. Even though, you know, I'm Nigerian, I come from here, but this is a huge country. And if you're trying to make change, you have to work with people who are on the ground. And so part of what we do is to make sure that we're actually working with civil society organizations whose work align with what it is that we want to achieve. So we don't go out you know, telling people what to do. We are looking for people who are already doing those things that Darren talked about, who are interested in ending inequality, who are working in democracy, gender-based violence, and we identify them. And what we do is that the resources we give to them amplify the work that they do. The money doesn't make them start doing what they're doing. So they will have been doing what they were doing anyway, even if we didn't come along. The only thing is that the funds that we're providing is making it easier and faster for them. So the fact that we have an alignment with our partners is critical. And that also means that they have the liberty and the freedom to do what they do. One of the things that Ford is known for and which our partners really appreciate is the fact that we give a lot of flexible funding because society is dynamic. And we recognize that. And so when we give support, we allow our partners to think about the work in a way that is organic and in a way that responds very quickly to the challenges in society. That makes it possible for people to, you know, to be flexible and to be impactful. And so we know that what we're doing is working because we identify people who are doing it anyway. And we also have people who have, you know, a passion and a consciousness for the work that they're doing. And so we don't need to monitor them, you know, like micro-monitor them, because these are people who want to do the work regardless of whether we're supporting them or not. So I think that's the most critical thing that we've done, that we're identifying people who have a shared, you know, goal, shared ideas, shared methodology with us, and who will have done the work whether we came or not.
And we support the institutions.
Yes.
Because in a democracy, the progress ebbs and flows. I will use my own country as an example. We have supported the issue of enfranchisement of black voters who were disenfranchised until the 1960s. So in the 1960s, the Ford Foundation was funding legal actions against the states of Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. Great progress was made. Fast forward to 2021. We made grants for litigation against the states of Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. What happened? Democracy is messy. We make progress, we regress. But what is necessary, as we have supported here in this great country, are institutions that are part and parcel of the ecosystem, that are credible, have currency in community, and represent the needs and aspirations and dreams of the Nigerian people.
So, I mean, you give away, from what I read, I mean, something like $500 million a year, possibly more. I wonder how you actually replenish that money that you give away, because I mean, I read somewhere that you, at one point, you issued the first ever social bond by a foundation. In other words, you went to borrowing.
Well, that was a moment when to borrow was the best option if we wanted during COVID to increase significantly our funding. And as Dr. Chichi said, one of the things we do is fund unrestricted general operating support to the NGOs. And we wanted during COVID, in a time of crisis, to significantly increase. And the markets were in our favor. I was a banker. I understand how these things work.
Right.
So we were able to structure quite quickly, in the middle of a crisis, the first ever $1 billion social bond, which allowed us to double our giving to $1.1 billion each year for 2 years during COVID. The purpose of that, though, was to support mission-critical institutions all around the world who were themselves in crisis and dealing with communities in crisis. And so the work of a foundation should be to be flexible, to be responsive, to be adaptive, and to understand the needs of people locally and listen to what they say their priorities are, rather than coming in with the top down, which in all candor was the way development used to be done. The rural villages on this continent are littered with the carcasses of development schemes that were not owned by local communities, that were not designed actually with them in mind, but were designed by experts at Harvard and Yale, when in fact the real expertise is in communities. So one of the lessons we've learned at the Ford Foundation is to not privilege the credentialed experts over the people with expertise who are closest to the challenges and who often have the knowledge that we need to solve these problems.
Right. We're coming perilously close to the end of the chat. Jolly brilliant chat, I have to say. But let me ask you this, Dr. Chichi. From a local point of view, being West Africa, you've told us a lot about what you're doing, what your priorities are this year. What are they going to be next year? What are the areas that the Ford Foundation will be going forward? And I mean, just briefly.
So we actually make sure that we have like a 5-year plan, because you don't want to go from year to year doing different things, because then you won't have impact. So for the next 5 years, we will be working on gender-based violence and natural resource and climate change. But we're also working on local philanthropy, because we recognize that we need to build local philanthropy to take on the space that a lot of development partners are leaving as resources dwindling in that area. So that's another critical area. Democracy and human rights continue to be something that we are very interested in and very keen to support. During the dark years of Abacha, the Ford Foundation was the only organization that stayed behind in Nigeria, and that legacy continues. So we will continue to work in trying to promote democracy, especially now that there's a return to military rule in many West African countries. And we'll continue to work with our partners and of course, identify new ones. The Ford Foundation is one of the few organizations that actually, can support government, and so we will continue to find partnerships with government where that works and support them. So for the next 5 years, we will continue to do the things that we have laid out to do so that we can see impact.
Right. And Mr. Walker, in the dying moments of our chat, the Ford Foundation, she talked about some areas. Does that come from the top? Or, I mean, there's the Ford Foundation stepping into areas that it hasn't stepped into before? Do you sort of formulate the policy and then they pick it up and run with it?
We develop together broad themes based on our focus on inequality, and locally those themes are defined in very specific and concrete grant-making strategies. But Charles, I like to always remind people that at the Ford Foundation, we are in the business of hope. We are, wherever we are in the world, whether it is in Delhi or Jakarta or New York. We are there to serve the dreams, the aspirations, the hopes of the people who live in a country, a region, who deserve to live with dignity. And so every day I get up and have the best job in the world. And this year we're giving away over $700 million. And that will be distributed with the aspiration that we can bring some modicum of hope, with all humility, given that it is a very small amount of money on the global
But in
scale.
that respect, what would be your message to the people of Nigeria? And I talk about those people who need hope, as well as the people whose job it is to give that hope.
Well, let's just say we are very bullish on Nigeria at the Ford Foundation. And my message to this country, to the leaders in this country, is to listen. Listen to your citizenry and respond to their needs. To the private sector, to industry, to do all that you can to have inclusive economic policy and business practices that bring everyone into your corporation, whether it be the disabled or women, so that we can truly live in a Nigeria that is inclusive, where there is shared prosperity for all.
And on that bucolic note, I want to say thank you very much indeed. Darren Walker is the president of the Ford Foundation, and Dr. Chichi Aniagolu Okoye is the foundation's regional director in West Africa. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you.
Thank you for having me.